December 7, 1945, Fort Sam Houston, Texas. 4 years to the day after Pearl Harbor, something extraordinary happened in a prisoner of war camp that would challenge everything Americans thought they knew about their Japanese enemies. In a mess hall filled with the scent of vanilla wafers and ripe bananas, 43 Japanese women prisoners sat before bowls of southern banana pudding and wept. Not quiet tears of homesickness or defeat, but deep shaking sobs that echoed off the wooden walls and left their American captors standing frozen in confusion and unexpected compassion. These weren't ordinary tears, and these weren't ordinary prisoners. Before we discover what transformed bitter enemies into broken, grateful women crying over a simple American dessert, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. The scene that unfolded that December afternoon defied every expectation of how prisoners of war should behave. Captain Dorothy Callahan stood at the entrance to the mess hall, watching as her staff served dessert to the Japanese Women's Auxiliary Corps members who had been in American custody for 6 months. She had approved the menu herself, thinking that a traditional Southern dessert might bring some holiday cheer to her own homesick staff. She never imagined what it would mean to the prisoners. The pudding arrived in simple metal bowls, each portion carefully layered with vanilla wafers, sliced bananas, and rich custard topped with peaks of meringue that had been lightly browned. It was the kind of dessert that grandmothers across the South had been making for generations, a symbol of abundance and comfort that spoke of home, family, and the sweetness of life beyond war. When the first bowl was placed before Chiyo Matsuda, a 24-year-old nurse from Osaka, her hands trembled as she lifted the spoon. The other Japanese women watched her with the careful attention that had characterized every meal since their arrival. They had learned to eat American food mechanically, without comment or visible reaction, maintaining the dignity that military training had drilled into them. But when Chiyo tasted that first spoonful, something inside her shattered. The creamy sweetness, the soft texture of banana, the gentle crunch of vanilla wafer, all combined into something she had not experienced in years. Abundance, generosity, the possibility that life could still hold simple pleasures even in captivity. Her shoulders began to shake, and tears streamed down her face as she took another spoonful, then another. Within moments, the emotional dam broke throughout the mess hall. Fumiko Ishikawa covered her face with both hands, her bowl untouched as sobs racked her small frame. Reiko Hayashi bent forward over her dessert, tears falling directly into the pudding as she whispered something in Japanese that the American guards could not understand. Noriko Saito and Midori Oshiro held hands across their table, both crying, as they attempted to eat, each spoonful seeming to release months of suppressed emotion. The story of those tears begins 6 months earlier, in June of 1945, when the first transport of Japanese women prisoners arrived at the makeshift facility outside Fort Sam Houston. Unlike the larger camps that housed thousands of male prisoners, this compound had been hastily constructed to accommodate fewer than 50 women, a number so small that many in the military bureaucracy questioned whether a separate facility was even necessary. But the capture of Japanese Women's Auxiliary Corps members presented unique challenges that male prison camps were not equipped to handle. The women arrived on a sweltering Texas afternoon, stepping down from military trucks with faces that revealed nothing of what they might be feeling. They wore remnants of their khaki auxiliary uniforms, some still bearing the insignia of the Imperial Japanese Army Medical Corps. Their movements were precise and military, their backs straight despite obvious exhaustion from weeks of transport across the Pacific. They formed orderly lines without being told, their eyes fixed on some invisible point in the middle distance, refusing to acknowledge the American soldiers who surrounded them. Captain Dorothy Callahan watched from the administration building as her staff processed the new arrivals. She had requested this assignment specifically, believing that female prisoners needed female oversight, But now, facing the reality of these women, she felt the weight of responsibility settle heavily on her shoulders. These were not defeated soldiers grateful for survival. They were women who had been taught that capture meant dishonor worse than death. And everything about their rigid posture suggested they expected the worst from their American captors. Among the new prisoners, Chiyo Matsuda stood near the center of the formation. At 24 years old, she had served as a nurse with the Japanese forces in the Philippines for nearly 2 years before her field hospital was overrun by advancing American troops. She carried with her only what she had been wearing when captured, a single silk handkerchief embroidered with cherry blossoms that her mother had given her before she left Osaka. That handkerchief, now faded and worn, represented the only tangible connection to a life that felt increasingly distant and unreal. Chiyo had joined the Women's Auxiliary Corps in 1943, motivated by a mixture of patriotic duty and genuine desire to use her nursing training in service of her country. She had believed the propaganda about American brutality, about enemies who showed no mercy and took no prisoners except to torture them. When American soldiers had surrounded her field hospital, she had fully expected to die. Instead, they had given her water, treated her wounds, and transported her with unexpected care across thousands of miles of ocean to this strange, hot place that looked nothing like any part of Japan she had ever seen. The processing took hours. Each woman was photographed, documented, and assigned a prisoner number. They were issued clean uniforms, American military surplus that hung loosely on their smaller frames. They were shown to barracks that, while sparse, were clean and equipped with real beds, not the bamboo mats many had been sleeping on in field conditions. The first weeks at Fort Sam Houston established a pattern that seemed destined to define the entire period of captivity. The Japanese women moved through their days like ghosts, present in body but absent in spirit. They rose at dawn without being called, made their beds with hospital corners that would have satisfied the strictest drill sergeant, and formed perfect lines for meals without a single word passing between them in the presence of their captors. They ate in complete silence, their eyes fixed on their plates, never looking up at the American staff who served them or at each other. Captain Dorothy Callahan found this silence more unsettling than any hostility would have been. She had expected anger, perhaps even attempts at resistance or escape. Instead, she faced a wall of blank compliance that revealed nothing of what these women thought or felt. They followed every instruction with mechanical precision, but there was no engagement, no acknowledgement that they saw their captors as human beings rather than simply uniforms representing enemy authority. Corporal Lucille Brennan, a farm girl from rural Georgia who had joined the Women's Army Corps to escape the cotton fields, found the prisoners' behavior particularly troubling. She had been raised to believe that hospitality and kindness were sacred duties, that even strangers deserved a warm greeting and a friendly word. The Japanese women's refusal to meet her eyes felt like a personal rejection, though she understood intellectually that they had been trained to view Americans as something less than human. Private Vernon Hayes, assigned to perimeter security, noticed how the women moved in the exercise yard. They walked in pairs, always maintaining proper spacing, their conversations conducted in whispers so soft that even the guards who spoke Japanese could not overhear. There was an invisible discipline that governed every aspect of their behavior, a code that clearly forbade any appearance of friendliness or cooperation beyond the minimum required for survival. What the American staff did not understand was the tremendous internal struggle taking place behind those blank expressions. Chiyo Matsuda lay awake each night in her barracks bunk, listening to the quiet breathing of 42 other women, and wrestled with thoughts that would have been considered treasonous just weeks earlier. The Americans had not tortured them. They had not been executed or abused. Instead, they had been given clean clothes, adequate food, and medical care for injuries and illnesses. This reality conflicted so fundamentally with everything she had been taught that she could not reconcile the two narratives. Fumiko Ishikawa, a former radio operator from Tokyo, whispered to Chio one night after lights out, her voice barely audible in the darkness. "They treat us better than our own officers did in the Philippines. Does that make us traitors for noticing?" Chio had no answer. To acknowledge kindness from the enemy felt like a betrayal of everything they had sacrificed. Yet to deny the evidence of their own eyes seemed equally dishonest. So they maintained their silence, that wall of non-engagement serving as protection against questions too dangerous to ask and answers too disturbing to accept. The silence became their shield, their last defense against the possibility that everything they had believed about this war might have been a lie. The first crack in the wall of silence appeared on a morning in late July, when the Texas heat had turned the barracks into ovens, and even the early dawn offered little relief. Chio Matsuda had been fighting a persistent fever for 3 days, refusing to report to the infirmary out of pride and fear. She had seen what happened to sick prisoners in Japanese military facilities, how they became burdens to be managed rather than patients to be healed. She assumed American attitudes would be similar, perhaps worse. But Corporal Lucille Brennan had been watching her with growing concern. Lucille had grown up nursing sick animals and younger siblings through fevers and illnesses, and she recognized the glassy-eyed look of someone pushing themselves beyond their body's limits. On the fourth morning, when Chio stumbled slightly during morning formation, Lucille made a decision that violated no official rules, but crossed an invisible boundary that had been carefully maintained since the prisoner's arrival. She approached Chio during the midday break, carrying a canteen of cool water and a small cloth bag that smelled of herbs. The other Japanese women watched with suspicious tension as the American corporal stopped directly in front of their group. Chio stood rigidly, her face carefully blank despite the fever that made her vision swim. Lucille spoke slowly, using simple words and gestures to communicate across the language barrier. "You sick?" she said, pointing at Chio, and then miming someone with a fever. "My grandmother," she made rocking motions as if holding a baby, then pointed to the herb bag. "Medicine. Help. Fever." She held out the bag and the canteen, her round Georgia face open and concerned in a way that completely contradicted everything Chio had been taught about American cruelty. For a long moment, nobody moved. The other prisoners watched to see how Chio would respond. To accept help from the enemy could be seen as weakness, as collaboration. But the fever was making it hard to think clearly, and something in Lucille's expression reminded Chio painfully of her own mother's face when she had nursed childhood illnesses. Slowly, carefully, Chio reached out and accepted the canteen. She drank deeply, the cool water soothing her parched throat. Then she took the herb bag, bringing it to her nose to smell the familiar scent of mint and chamomile, herbs that grew in Japan as well as America, plants that recognized no national boundaries or wartime allegiances. "Thank you," Chio whispered, in heavily accented English, the first word she had spoken directly to an American guard since her capture. Lucille's face broke into a wide smile. "You welcome, honey. You rest now." That evening, Chio used the herbs to make tea, sharing it with Fumiko and Reiko, who had also been fighting minor ailments. As they sipped the soothing liquid, they spoke in quiet Japanese about what had happened. "The American woman did not have to help you," Fumiko observed. "She chose to." "Perhaps," Reiko added carefully, "perhaps they are not what we were told they were." The thought hung in the air between them, dangerous and impossible to ignore. Small gestures were beginning to plant seeds of doubt, tiny cracks in the propaganda that had shaped their entire understanding of this war and their enemies. November of 1945 brought cooler temperatures to Texas and an unprecedented decision from Captain Dorothy Callahan. The war in the Pacific had ended in August with Japan's surrender, but the process of repatriation remained complicated by the sheer logistics of transporting thousands of prisoners across vast ocean distances. The Japanese women at Fort Sam Houston existed in a strange limbo, no longer quite prisoners of war, but not yet free to return home. Captain Callahan had been observing the gradual thaw in relations between her staff and the prisoners, the small conversations that were beginning to happen despite language barriers, the way the Japanese women had started to show curiosity about American customs rather than maintaining their earlier rigid isolation. She decided that Thanksgiving presented an opportunity to demonstrate something fundamental about American culture, something that might help these women understand the country that had defeated theirs. She announced her plan to Sergeant Lloyd Chen, whose Chinese heritage and fluent Japanese made him invaluable as a translator. "I want to invite the prisoners to share Thanksgiving dinner with us, not a separate meal, but the same food, the same time, the same space." Sergeant Chen raised his eyebrows but nodded slowly. "It will confuse them, Captain. In their culture, captors and captives do not share meals as equals." "That is exactly why we need to do it," she replied. "They need to understand that America fights wars differently than they were taught." When Sergeant Chen translated Captain Callahan's invitation to the assembled prisoners, the reaction was visible confusion mixed with suspicion. Chio exchanged glances with Fumiko and Reiko, trying to understand what hidden purpose this invitation might serve. Was this some kind of test? A trap designed to identify prisoners who were too eager to collaborate with their captors? But Captain Callahan had anticipated their hesitation. Through Sergeant Chen, she explained the history and meaning of Thanksgiving, how it celebrated gratitude, harvest, and the joining of different peoples in shared abundance. She spoke about pilgrims and Native Americans, about survival through cooperation, about the American belief that former enemies could become friends across a dinner table. The concept was so foreign to everything the Japanese women had been taught about warfare and honor that they struggled to process it. On Thanksgiving Day, the mess hall had been transformed. Long tables were set with actual tablecloths borrowed from local churches. American staff and Japanese prisoners would sit alternating, mixed together rather than separated by the invisible barriers that had defined their previous months together. The food arrived in abundant waves that left the prisoners stunned. Turkey roasted golden brown, its skin crackling and fragrant. Mashed potatoes whipped smooth and topped with butter that melted into pale pools. Cranberry sauce, both jellied and whole berry. Sweet potato casserole crowned with toasted marshmallows. Green beans with slivered almonds. Cornbread dressing rich with sage and onions. And pies, so many pies, pumpkin and pecan and apple, their spices filling the air with scents that spoke of celebration and plenty. Chio sat between Corporal Lucille Brennan and Private Vernon Hayes, her plate piled with food in quantities she had not seen since before the war. Lucille demonstrated how to carve the turkey, explaining each dish's significance in her warm Georgia drawl while Sergeant Chen translated. Vernon showed her how to make a proper gravy well in her mashed potatoes, his movements patient and instructional rather than condescending. The fragile sense of community that had begun to develop around Thanksgiving was shattered in early December when newspapers arrived at Fort Sam Houston carrying detailed reports and photographs from Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Captain Dorothy Callahan had debated whether to allow the prisoners access to these newspapers, knowing the devastating impact the images would have. But she ultimately decided that the women deserved to know the full truth about what had ended the war and what awaited them when they returned home. Sergeant Lloyd Chen gathered the prisoners in the recreation hall and began reading translations of the articles. His voice remained steady and professional, but even he struggled with the descriptions of destruction that went beyond anything warfare had previously achieved. Entire cities reduced to ash and shadow, tens of thousands killed instantly, with tens of thousands more dying slowly from radiation sickness. Survivors wandering through ruins, searching for family members who had been vaporized, leaving only dark silhouettes burned into concrete walls. Chio sat frozen as she listened, her mind trying to comprehend the scale of devastation being described. Hiroshima was not far from Osaka. She had cousins who had moved there for work before the war. Had they survived? Were they among the shadow people in the photographs, or had they been lucky enough to die instantly? The questions spun through her mind with sickening velocity, each possibility more horrifying than the last. Fumiko began to weep quietly, her hands pressed against her mouth, as if trying to hold back sounds of anguish. Her entire family lived in Nagasaki. She had received no word from them since her capture, and now she understood with terrible certainty that she might never hear from them again. The city where she had grown up, where she had attended school and dreamed of becoming a teacher, had been erased from existence in a single blinding moment. But the physical destruction, as horrifying as it was, represented only part of the emotional devastation the women experienced that day. The newspapers also carried reports from American soldiers who had liberated Allied prisoners of war from Japanese camps throughout the Pacific. The descriptions of starvation, torture, and systematic brutality inflicted on American and British prisoners contradicted everything the women had been told about how their military conducted itself. Reiko Hayashi had served as an administrator in a supply depot, processing requisitions and maintaining records. She had believed she was supporting a defensive war, helping Japan protect itself from American aggression. Now she read accounts of the Bataan Death March, of prisoners forced to work until they died, of medical experiments conducted on living human beings. Her hands trembled as she held the newspaper, the carefully maintained narrative of Japanese honor and American cruelty collapsing like a house built on sand. Noriko Saito spoke first, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying clearly in the silent hall. We were told that Americans tortured prisoners, that they showed no mercy, but they have shown us nothing but kindness. Why did they lie to us? Midori Oshiro looked up from the photographs, her face streaked with tears. Perhaps they lied about everything. Perhaps we were never the victims. Perhaps we were always the monsters. The words hung in the air like an accusation and a confession combined. December 7th arrived with a significance that nobody at Fort Sam Houston could ignore. 4 years exactly since Pearl Harbor, the date that had transformed America from observer to combatant, the morning that had justified everything that followed, including the imprisonment of the women now living in the compound outside Captain Dorothy Callahan's office. The captain had consulted with her staff about how to handle this anniversary, whether to acknowledge it or let it pass unremarked. It was Mrs. Beatrice Whitfield who provided the answer. Mrs. Whitfield was a local volunteer who had been coming to the camp twice weekly since September, teaching basic English to prisoners who showed interest and helping in the kitchen when extra hands were needed. She was a widow whose own son had died at Guadalcanal, a loss that had left her with a choice between bitterness and grace. She had chosen grace, though it had not come easily. "Captain," she said in her soft East Texas drawl, "my grandmother always said that the best way to mark a hard day is with something sweet. Not to forget, mind you, but to remember that life goes on and can still hold good things. I'd like to make my banana pudding for everyone today, Americans and Japanese alike." Captain Callahan considered the request carefully. There was something almost subversive about serving dessert to Japanese prisoners on Pearl Harbor Day, something that would undoubtedly generate criticism if word got out. But there was also something profoundly American about it, something that spoke to the country's capacity for moving forward without forgetting, for acknowledging pain while still choosing generosity. She approved the request. Mrs. Whitfield arrived that afternoon with ingredients borrowed and purchased from half a dozen sources. Sugar was still being rationed, but she had been saving her coupons for weeks. She had convinced the local grocer to part with his last cases of bananas, a luxury that rarely made it to this part of Texas. She brought vanilla wafers from her own pantry, eggs from her neighbor's chickens, and real vanilla extract that she had been hoarding since before the war. In the camp kitchen, she worked alongside Corporal Lucille Brennan and 2 of the Japanese prisoners who had been helping with meal preparation. Fumiko Ishikawa watched with fascination as Mrs. Whitfield layered the ingredients, explaining each step in simple English that Fumiko was beginning to understand. First, the vanilla wafers, creating a foundation of sweetness, then sliced bananas, their fruit flesh soft and yielding. Then custard, cooked slowly on the stove until it reached the perfect consistency, rich with egg yolks and sugar and that precious vanilla extract, layer after layer, building something that was greater than the sum of its parts. The meringue came last, egg whites whipped to stiff peaks and spread across the top before the whole creation went into the oven to brown. When it emerged 20 minutes later, golden and fragrant, even the kitchen staff who had watched its creation stood silent for a moment, struck by the simple beauty of it. That evening, when the bowls were distributed in the mess hall, something unprecedented happened. Captain Callahan had planned to eat in her office as usual, but Mrs. Whitfield had insisted she join everyone in the dining area. American staff and Japanese prisoners sat at the same tables they had shared since Thanksgiving. But tonight there was additional tension in the air. The tears that had filled the mess hall on December 7th did not stop when the banana pudding bowls were empty. They continued through the evening and into the following days, but their meaning gradually shifted from pure emotional release to something more complex and transformative. Chiyo Matsuda found herself unable to articulate what she had experienced in that moment when sweetness touched her tongue. It was not simply the taste, though that had been extraordinary after months of plain institutional food. It was what the taste represented. Someone had spent hours creating something beautiful and delicious specifically for them, for women who had been enemies, whose countrymen had killed that woman's son. The generosity was incomprehensible and therefore devastating. In the days following what the prisoners began to call among themselves the pudding moment, conversations in the barracks took on new depth and honesty. Women who had maintained careful emotional distance began sharing stories of their lives before the war, their families, their dreams that had been interrupted by military service and capture. Fumiko spoke about her mother's kitchen in Nagasaki, how she had learned to make traditional sweets, how food had always been her family's love language. Now that kitchen was gone, vaporized in an instant, and she would never taste her mother's cooking again. But she had tasted something in that American pudding that reminded her that sweetness could still exist in the world, that life might hold moments of grace even amid profound loss. Reiko shared how she had believed she was serving honor by joining the Auxiliary Corps, how she had thought herself part of something noble and necessary. The banana pudding had forced her to confront an uncomfortable truth, that the Americans who had defeated Japan were not monsters, but ordinary people capable of extraordinary kindness. If she had been wrong about that, what else had she been wrong about? Noriko and Midori talked quietly about their fears of returning to Japan. They would be seen as failures, as women who had allowed themselves to be captured and corrupted by enemy influence. Worse, they would return to a country that had been revealed as something very different from what they had believed they were defending. How could they go home when home itself had become a lie? Chiyo listened to all these conversations and began to understand something that would shape the rest of her life. The banana pudding had not been simply a dessert. It had been a lesson in what America represented at its best, a demonstration that abundance could be shared rather than hoarded, that former enemies could be welcomed to the table, that redemption was possible even for those who had fought on the wrong side of history. She began teaching this understanding to the other prisoners, not through speeches, but through example. When Corporal Lucille Brennan offered to teach more English, Chiyo enthusiastically accepted and encouraged others to join when Private Vernon Hayes asked if anyone wanted to learn about American history. She volunteered immediately. When Mrs. Beatrice Whitfield returned to the camp and offered to teach her banana pudding recipe, Chiyo was the first to ask for paper and pencil to write it down. January of 1946 brought official word from Washington regarding repatriation procedures for the Japanese women at Fort Sam Houston, Captain Dorothy Callahan received detailed instructions about transportation schedules, processing requirements, and timelines for returning the prisoners to their homeland. Ships would depart from San Francisco in early March, carrying thousands of Japanese prisoners back across the Pacific to a country most of them had not seen in years. The announcement was made on a cold morning when frost still clung to the barracks windows. Sergeant Lloyd Chen translated the official orders while the 43 women sat in assembled silence, their faces revealing the complex emotions churning beneath carefully maintained composure. They would have 6 weeks to prepare for departure, to gather what few possessions they had accumulated, to say goodbye to the Americans who had become something more complicated than simply captors. But after the formal announcement ended, something unprecedented occurred. Chiyo Matsuda stood slowly, her hands clasped in front of her in a gesture that combined respect with determination. "Captain Callahan, may I speak?" "Permission granted," the captain replied, curious about what would come next. Chiyo looked around at her fellow prisoners before continuing in the careful English she had worked so hard to master. "Some of us have been talking together for many weeks. We do not know what waits for us in Japan. Many of us have no family remaining. Some of us fear we will be treated as failures, as dishonored women who were captured. All of us have learned things here that make us question who we were and who we wish to become." She paused, gathering courage for what came next. "We wish to ask if there is possibility to remain in America, not as prisoners, but as people who want to start again, to become better than we were." The words created a ripple of shock through both the American staff and the Japanese prisoners. Fumiko Ishikawa stood next, followed by Reiko Hayashi, then Noriko Saito and Midori Oshiro. 11 women in total rose from their seats, making visible their support for Chiyo's unprecedented request. Captain Callahan found herself genuinely surprised despite months of observing the growing bonds between her staff and the prisoners. The legal and bureaucratic complications of such a request were staggering. These were enemy nationals, women who had served the military forces of a country America had been fighting for 4 years. Yet she also understood what courage it took for them to make this request, what it meant that they would rather face uncertainty in a foreign land than return to the familiar ruins of home. "I cannot make this decision alone," the captain said honestly. "This requires approval from officials far above my authority, but I will forward your request through proper channels and advocate for your cause. Can you tell me why you wish to stay?" "What America has shown us," Chiyo replied, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was saying, "is that people can change, that enemies can become friends." 20 years later, in 1965, Chiyo Matsuda stood in the arrivals hall of Tokyo International Airport, carrying a small suitcase and a carefully wrapped package that contained a handwritten recipe for southern banana pudding. She had returned to Japan not as a defeated prisoner seeking forgiveness, but as a cultural ambassador invited by the Japanese-American Friendship Society to speak about reconciliation and the bridges that could be built between former enemies. The Japan she found was almost unrecognizable from the one she had left. Cities had been rebuilt with modern architecture that reached toward the sky. The economy was booming, transforming the nation from defeated power to emerging industrial giant. Young people walked the streets in Western clothing, listening to American music, embracing a future that looked nothing like the past their parents had fought to preserve. But Chiyo had not come to marvel at buildings or economic statistics. She had come to share a story about how a simple dessert had changed her life and the lives of 10 other women who had made the same impossible choice she had made in that Texas prison camp 2 decades earlier. Of the 11 who had requested to remain in America, 9 had been granted special immigration status after months of bureaucratic review and local sponsorship. Chiyo had been taken in by Mrs. Beatrice Whitfield herself, living in the widow's home while learning English and eventually training as a translator. She had become an American citizen in 1952, had married a Japanese-American man whose family had survived the internment camps, and had raised 2 children who knew both cultures as home. Her speech at the Friendship Society was attended by hundreds, including several Japanese women who had served in the Auxiliary Corps and returned home after the war. She spoke about fear and propaganda, about the lies they had all believed, and the difficult process of confronting truth. But mostly she spoke about banana pudding and what it had taught her about grace. In my darkest moment, she told the audience, when I had lost everything I thought defined me, an American woman whose son I might have helped kill with my service offered me sweetness, not because I deserved it, but because she chose to see my humanity rather than my uniform. She held up the recipe card, its edges worn from years of use and sharing. This recipe is not just instructions for making dessert. It is a blueprint for peace. You take simple ingredients, layer them with care and patience, and create something that brings people together across any divide. The audience sat in silence as she concluded. We cannot change the past or undo the harm that was done, but we can choose what we create for the future. We can choose to offer sweetness instead of bitterness, to build bridges instead of walls, to remember that our former enemies are simply people who were taught different lies than we were.